So, anyone got any idea about when you're going around looking for... well, you know what? Never mind. While Cyberdogs was well propagated through the shareware distribution channels of the time, today's ancient DOS game, CDogs, the pseudo-sequel to Cyberdogs, went widely unknown until the internet started to become more of a place for the distribution of indie games. Now, I call this game a pseudo-sequel because it's not technically a sequel to Cyberdogs, rather it's more of a reimagining of it, making for a game system that's a lot more expandable, with a lot more potentials for customization, and a lot of pre-included content to start you off before you dive into making your own missions with the included editor. However, CDogs is also many times more difficult to play than Cyberdogs, even on easier difficulty settings, which may also be part of the reason why Cyberdogs is more commonly known than CDogs. It has some other quirky things about it too, which makes it feel like a lesser version of Cyberdogs, and mostly just a lack of polish, which has also led some to believe that this thing came before Cyberdogs. Rest assured though, this is indeed the successor of Cyberdogs, not the predecessor. CDogs was developed and released by Ronny Wester in 1998 and is a 1 to 2 player action game. Now, some sites actually get the release dates of this game in Cyberdogs wrong, listing patch update years instead of actual release years, with the copyright on CDogs even starting in 1997. But as far as I'm aware, the first actual release of the game was in 1998. In terms of video, it only supports VGA 320x200 256 color graphics, and in terms of audio, it only supports Sound Blaster cards as far as I can tell. Though admittedly, it's hard to know for certain, as even the author isn't completely sure of all the details of the audio library he used to make this game. As for its current release date, the game's always been freeware. It can be downloaded from a number of websites, although even nowadays it's not as prevalent as Cyberdogs. Well, I'm going to go ahead and recommend the DOS Games website at www.dosgames.com, just for sake of simplicity. So anyone coming into this thing from Cyberdogs knows what to expect in terms of overall gameplay. However, there are a substantial number of differences from before, so let's go over them. The first major change is that now the game has actual campaigns, each with a storyline to follow and multiple missions, each mission having one or more objectives to meet. 2 of the campaigns are built into the game, with 3 external campaigns included as well, which you can even use as templates for making your own campaigns when you delve into the editor. You can also create your own characters now, which you can save and load and use in whatever campaigns and missions you want, though this only comes down to aesthetics, as the missions themselves are what determines the weapons that you have access to. Another major change is to the weapon system. Instead of having to buy and sell weapons and equipment, you select up to 3 weapons to bring into each mission and have unlimited ammo with all of them. The trick, though, is that each time you fire a shot, you lose points. Thus, to get the highest scores possible, you need to aim well and waste as few shots as possible. Though really, if you just want to progress through each mission with no care of the score, then you don't really have to pay attention to this. However, the lack of an equipment store has also deprived the game of some customization aspects and has actually made the game a little harder in the process, even before we take into account the increased difficulty of the enemies overall. Firstly, there's no extra lives. If you run out of health, the game is over, simple as that. And granted, if you go right back into a campaign you just fell out of, it'll automatically input your latest password to start the mission over, though your score up to that point will be lost. There's also no longer a chainsaw system in place. Instead, to do melee damage, you must have a knife equipped, meaning you can't just run straight through enemies, which get in your way anymore. You need to arm the knife first. Although, not everyone you face is an enemy. Civilians or friendly characters will often be part of the mix now, and in the campaigns included, it's usually simple enough to tell friend from foe. Although the editor is more than capable of making enemies which look just like allies. There is a score penalty for hurting civilians, although nothing more than that, so unless you're playing for score, you don't really have to worry about them too much. Another big change is that the controls themselves. The original Cyberdogs gave players the ability to strafe by holding the weapon changing button. Now, instead of a strafe ability, you have what's referred to as a slide ability, although a more appropriate name would be dash, as pressing the weapon changing button while moving will instead cause you to dash a short distance at extreme speed. There's no penalty for using this ability, although it can be tricky to control, so you need to be careful with it. There's a rather large slew of options this time around too. For instance, the randomization seed for map generation is changeable in-game now, though there's no way to set it to be completely random. You can even adjust the health of enemies and player characters to make the game easier or harder, and can adjust the overall difficulty, which only affects how often the enemies act and attack. You can even turn player damage on if you want to be able to hurt a second player accidentally, though if you want to do it intentionally, there's a dogfight mode now so 2 players can duke it out. One last thing I want to say about the gameplay itself is that there's an option to show the system clock in the bottom left corner while playing. Although this may seem like an odd feature, it's actually kind of nostalgic for me. See, back when I was still a teenager, I'd be coding at school during my break periods, but everything I coded would run full screen, so it was difficult to keep track of the time. Thus, one of the first features I put into just about everything I made back then was a clock so that I could keep track of the time and be ready to leave when classes approached. And what I'm saying is that adding system clocks to games without blending them into the game world is something that's typically done for the sake of the coder, not the end user. And it's always neat whenever I find out about another game programmer who did this kind of thing with their own stuff. Most of the weapons from Cyberdogs are actually missing from this game, with a couple exceptions. Instead, there's a brand new selection of weapons to choose from. I'm not going to go into excessive detail about most of them, but rather, I just want to give you all an idea of what's available and what you can do with them, keeping in mind that not every weapon is available for every mission. The knife is a passive weapon, although it needs to be armed to be used. And just arm it and run continually into an enemy or an obstacle to damage it. Most enemies will get stunned while being knifed, although enemies with knives will likely be able to fight back in the process. In fact, this is something you'll quickly catch on to, is that you never want to fight an enemy with the same weapon they're using, as such battles will often just come down to who's got more health. The machine gun is technically just like the minigun from Cyberdogs, but has a little bit of randomness to its shot directions. The shotgun fires a spread of 5 shots, making it good for both short-range and long-range attacks, but it has a slow rate of fire. The flamer is one of the weapons to return from Cyberdogs and is basically a short-range machine gun that's easier to hit with due to having larger shots, and does more damage per shot. The power gun also makes a return from Cyberdogs, having a low rate of fire but doing a lot of damage, though there's an even more exemplified version of this weapon now called the sniper gun, which has an even lower rate of fire but does even more damage. However, the rest of the weapons are a lot more dangerous, as they're all capable of hurting you if you're not careful. Grenades explode shortly after being fired, but until they explode, they can bounce off of walls. Shrapnel bombs act the same way, but explode into numerous shrapnel pieces which fly off in all directions. Molotovs explode into a pool of fire on impact, lingering around for a moment. Now, I should note that all 3 of these weapons pass straight through sprites, meaning you can't just toss them at a bad guy and hope to kill them. Some extra aiming skill is necessary in using each of them. The last 2 weapons are proximity mines and dynamite, both of which are simply placed on the ground and have massive explosions. However, dynamite goes off after a moment, whereas proximity mines don't go off until something gets close, though they do have a short countdown once laid before they can go off at all. And it's not a terrible selection of weapons for sure, but the balancing needed to make these all work in tandem kinda breaks the experience a bit. Working up to more powerful weapons like in the first game seemed like a better and more rewarding approach. Not to mention being able to spam megagun shots everywhere without hurting yourself felt viscerally fun. I should also quickly point out that there's a few weapons the enemies can have which the players can't, but these weapons are either only designed to inflict status effects or are extremely difficult to aim in the first place. I haven't ever really done much with the editor to this game, but it's surprisingly in-depth in terms of what you can do with it. Each campaign is essentially a collection of missions and NPCs. Each mission consists of values to send to the randomizer, as well as selections for the graphical appearances of walls, keys, doors, etc. Each mission also has a number of objectives you can set up, with each objective having a surprisingly large number of options. And you can set exactly how much of an objective needs to be accomplished to be completed, plus you can set objectives to be hidden, thus worth bonus points if you discover and complete them. You can even set whether an objective requires keycard access or not to complete. The number of options available for configuring objectives is extreme. One thing that can be a little tricky at first though is just figuring out how to use this thing. Even though there's a mouse cursor you can use, it doesn't do a lot. Instead, you're typically going to use the mouse to point at things, then use the keyboard to adjust them. Now, even that's only going to get you so far though, as you need to use Alt plus other characters on the keyboard to do things like saving, viewing the map generation, or altering the NPCs. The Npc Editor is fairly simple, allowing you to create all the NPCs you intend to use in your campaign. When you set up each mission, you can then assign which NPCs you want to appear. The options for the NPCs themselves are fairly in-depth, though it can take a bit of trial and error to figure out what all the different settings do. And granted, even with that said, many of the settings should be self-explanatory. Overall, Sea Dogs is an interesting companion game to Cyberdogs, but not really a sequel in a true sense of the word. In fact, even the game's author admits that the popularity of Cyberdogs is what prompted him to make another game in the series as opposed to simply expanding on the original, suggesting that his original plan was to expand the first game and not make a second one. Compared to Cyberdogs, Sea Dogs has a lot more customization options and a ton of replay value thanks to its included editor. But from strictly a gameplay standpoint, Cyberdogs reigns supreme. I wouldn't recommend one game over the other, rather, I'd recommend to people who enjoy action games in general to just give both games a go sooner or later, as they both have their pros and cons. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to figure out how to keep the game from randomly crashing every once in a while. However, I did notice that setting a fixed cycles count helps, even though it's not necessary. I'm using a setting of 30,000 cycles, which I picked simply because that tends to be the most DOSBox can handle on most systems before emulation speed issues may become apparent. Also, the game plays much better with a gamepad than with the keyboard, and when playing the two-player mode, at least one person should be using a gamepad to avoid key lockups. To that end, the joystick support should work without any extra configuration required, but keep in mind that once you start a campaign, the controls will switch from the generic menu controls to player-specific controls. Anywho, that's all for today's episode of Ancient DOS Games. Episode 163 will be coming very soon on Saturday, May 16th, which should get me back on schedule. As for which game we'll be covering, it's the second game in its series, which is why it has a 3 in the title. Yeah, I don't get it either, and I'm gonna have to look into why that is. But in the meantime though, be sure to send your guess to adg@pixelships.com as soon as you can, because there isn't a lot of time to get your guess in before the next episode goes live.